with our first talk, which is on React Server Components, Should You Care, by Shashwat Prabhat. Can we have a round of applause, please?
Hi all, just give me a moment. I'll be sharing my screen. Just a minute. Is my screen visible and am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, visible here. Good. So, yeah, hi all, I am Shashwat, one of the speakers here, part of the UI community in Thoughtworks. So, welcome to this talk on React Server Components. The topic I had picked up was Should You Care, but we will reach to that by the time that we end the set of slides. So, we will quickly begin and let's see what we have here. So what I really want to do is go and understand the concepts around React Server Components. So we will be taking this as a story, and let's hope that by the time the story ends, we come up with some learnings. Yeah. So like any good story, we'll start with food. So I will be lending your imagination for a part of this talk. So yeah. So here I have two scenarios. So please help me imagine this if you can. Yeah. So the first is that you arrive at a restaurant to place an order. So you arrive at a table and you place the order. I hope a lot of us would have already done that. And you watch the chef cook the food. So there's a slight deviation here, as in the chef comes to your table and actually starts doing it from scratch. So you see the chef peel the onions, the chef dices the carrots. Yeah, the list does not go on, but you get the idea. And you finally get served the food. So this is one way of having a restaurant experience. And the second kind of experience, which is you again arrive at the table and you place the order, and you scroll the feed of your food. I think a lot of us would have done that, and you switch apps, and you repeat it. And after a while, you get served the food. So the idea being that the overall preparation of food, the entire process, is either abstracted away from you or it is there in front of you. Yeah. Okay. So now what if we could kind of combine the two ideas into one? So you arrive at the table and you place the order. Here the chef does come to your table, but again, the chef does not start cooking the food from scratch. Right? There are things that the chef already has. And it is kind of fast, and it is very shiny, and you get hypnotized. Maybe you stay away from your phone for a while, and you get served. Yeah. So yeah, please remember this analogy. I hope this will serve as a good example for what we want to cover for React Server Components. Yeah. So yeah, welcome to React Server Components, and that is a live counter. That is a chef. And the rice is already cooked. So yeah, that is what we want to highlight, that a piece of the puzzle would already be pre-built for us, and a piece of it would be built in front of us. Cool. So quickly covering what we will be covering in this talk. So what we want to really focus on is a conceptual deep dive of React Server Components. We want to ensure that we have a correct mental model when we think about React Server Components. We want to understand why React Server Components are there in the first place. Why can't we just use React, or how does it really compare with some of the things that Varnya had shared? Maybe you can think about Svelte, and maybe in the longer run, even Weave. And we will re-understand server. So I know that we would have an overall understanding of what a server is, but by the end of the talk, we want to re-evaluate some of that understanding as well. And EAM. So what we will not be covering as a part of this talk. So we will not be comparing the landscape of React Server Components. There are frameworks that are actually implementing React Server Components, but we will not be comparing that for a major part of the talk. Infra and setup. The concepts, though kind of complex. The infra setup is coming up to speed to that. There are options available out there. We will talk about them at the end of the slide, but will not be covering as a major topic of the slide. And the framework implementation. So we will again not be focusing on, let's say, Next or Remix or Hydrogen and each of those implementations. Our idea is again to have an overall understanding of server components as a framework, and then to maybe have enough idea around when we pick up the frameworks, which one should we go for. Yeah. So again, we want everyone to be involved in this talk as much as possible. So I have just set out a quick vocabulary check. So React, the client-side library for components-based web application. State, for now I just call them intelligent variables. We will look at how that idea evolves and if we need to rethink about what state is. CSR is client-side rendering. So something where we are sending a bunch of our package bundles onto the browser and the browser does the heavy lifting for us. Server-side rendering is when server does the heavy lifting for us. Okay, so now we begin in terms of the meat of the slides. So the first part that we will want to cover is kind of the motivation as well as where we are in terms of network chasm and attention deficit. So this is network chasm is a phrase that you will hear a lot throughout the slides. What we want to focus on is the network chasm, as in the network gap that is there between the browser and server. It has been an ancient problem. It will be a problem in the near future, but it is something that has actually not helped developers. It is one of the challenges that we have had to tackle for a long time. Now, as things are getting faster and our attention spans are reducing as a species, this is becoming quite a major burden. We want to grab users' attention in as much time as possible, but if the network chasm is too big, it becomes problematic to do so. We have lesser time to grab users' attention, and the user might be able to just switch apps while the user is at a restaurant. So, over the next set of slides, what we'll try and build up is a general understanding of how we can approach React Server Components. It is a mix of motivation as well as the decisions taken to come up with the idea. So the first part is, okay, the image is taken from Next.js's Server Components page, but this has been kind of an abstraction that we have been using for a long time. Any web page that you pick, you can kind of divide it into things that are interactive and things that are not interactive, right? So again, so here if you can see on this slide, you would have the C parts, the search, the button, and the S parts, the nav bar and sidebar. Now the idea is there are components on which the user might not be interacting that heavily, which would just be a view only, and there would be components that the user would be interacting a lot. This was kind of the initial challenge behind web development that led to the rise of React, Angular, and a lot of these client-side bundling frameworks, which would lend a lot of interactivity. Right? What we can also do is, of course, we can always segregate these into two. We have our client-side interactive components, we have our server-side non-interactive components. But the idea is we have been doing this for a while. We have been able to segregate this. This is not a new idea. But once we have segregated this, what do we do next? What would be the next logical step, right? So if I superimpose the idea of domains, we can think about micro frontend, which would kind of have a tangential idea to similarly creating abstractions of interactive as well as non-interactive components. Similarly, we have islands architecture kind of made famous by Astro. Similar. So if we divide our page into several interactive and non-interactive bits, we have islands that we can then switch up. Okay. So let's say we have reached this stage where we know that we have interactive and non-interactive components. What should I do with this information? So now this is a second part to it. Now this is a part that most of UIDs do not interact with directly, but this is kind of the setup and the infra bit of where we are at this point. So this picture is of the AWS distribution centers, the servers that are there. What we really want to focus on is first edge. So initially the idea of edge was something that is closer to the user, right? Something that is as to the user as possible, and that kind of evolved into CDNs. You would have content delivery networks. You would push content to the servers, and those would be pushed to the client as fast as possible. That is the reason that we had edge. But now we have the idea of edge runtimes. What that primarily means is you have compute, you have actual servers that are close to the user. You have compute and CPU facilities that are so close to the user that you might not even need CDN anymore. So what does that mean? What that kind of means is, again, going back to the phrase of network chasm, the difference or the delta between a browser and a server is reducing very fast, right? So in terms of the OSI stack, each and every part of the component is getting more faster and scalable. We have not covered 5G here, we don't want to, but that is again one of the examples. People will be able to reach your application layer as fast as possible. Now, are our application up to the mark to be able to take in that speed at which the user will be interacting with our component? So that speed comes from all the top layers above our application layer, as well as the attention deficit that we just talked about. Right? So that kind of poses a dual challenge for us. Right. So kind of summary of what we have covered. So the data stores, the services, and the browsers are quickly becoming this one gray entity. Each of them are getting more and more connected, right? While client-server architecture is still very much relevant, it might be time to unlearn some of the ideas behind client and server. The concepts are still very much important, and they will be. I think that was one of the basis of our computer science concepts and understanding. But at least from a UI perspective, we might need to unlearn some of what client and server means. And lastly, our applications, if we already have some live applications or if we are planning to build applications, we need to be in a place and be ready that our applications need to be the fastest that they possibly can be, right? And particularly in terms of UI, how can I achieve that? So this kind of converges with client-side rendering and server-side rendering, but not just that. The overall debate is around how can I make my UI application fast. So this is kind of where all of these ideas converge into RSC. So now I'll give a bit of a background around React Server Components. So I think around 2020, while we were locked in our houses, Dan gave a talk on the next generation of React. That was Server Components. The idea was, at least it spawned out from the idea of how we can do efficient data fetching on the server. So as you know, React does not really talk about how can we fetch data. We have libraries there and we have frameworks that have come up. But normally what we do is we might be placing it in a use effect, or we might be using some kind of logic or some libraries around that. The idea was, okay, what if we could do it in a React way? What if I superimpose React onto the idea of data fetching? And that was 2 years back. Yeah. So what they did at that point of time was they opened up a page for comments on the open source React page. And they asked the community for feedbacks on how the next generation of React might look like. The idea is to impose React model on server, and how far can I go with it, right? So over the past 2 years, the ideas have evolved to an extent that it's not in beta anymore. We have live running examples of React Server Components. We have frameworks that actually started supporting them. Yeah. So, okay. So over the next set of slides, what I have done is, because again, this is the request for comments page. So if you read it end to end, you would have some idea about what React Server Components is. But what I have done is I have picked up phrases from that entire document, which I feel sums up the idea of React Server Components very well. What we will want to do is we will go through each of those phrases. There are not a whole lot. And we will try and see how much of a conceptual understanding can we have before we move on to the next part. Yeah. Okay. So, okay, just a call out. This RFC is not RSC. This is a request for comments document. So this is the kind of the document that was added by the open source community, and this is kind of the spec for React Server Components. Yeah. Okay. So the first part, we kind of have touched on this for a while, which is spanning the client and server, right? So we have the client, which is the browser, and we have the server. So as I stated at the starting, that one of the aims of the talk is to understand server, right? So for now, when we talk about server, we'll just think about something that is ahead of time. So ahead of time in terms of the browser, right? So it can be something like a database, it can be something like a cache, but I won't be confusing it with something like a service layer or something specific to having compute, right? Anything that is ahead of time from a browser's perspective would be a server for. Now that is the idea that I want to start on, and then we build on top of that idea with each passing slide, right? So we are spanning client and server. What that means is, when I think of React Server Components, the first bit that I would want to at least conceptually imagine it's an umbrella, and my client and server are gradually coming closer together, and now I have an umbrella across both of them, right? Now with this umbrella, I think the first thing that starts to hit us is, okay, there's a friction. Mostly we think of React as a UI framework. It is, at least it was meant to be. But now that I'm bringing my server and client closer together and I'm thinking of, okay, now I have this umbrella of React, how am I going to bring together this idea of server with my client, right? But at least to start off, think of it, okay, I have an umbrella over my client and server that is coming quite close together into this gray entity for now. Yeah. Okay. Now this is something that I picked up again from the RFC, which is incrementally streaming of data. Now, the idea is not new. The idea is that, when we have a set of data that we want to send to the browser, if we can do it incrementally, if we can stream it, send to the browser in increments, and then the browser can progressively render the parts that are needed. Now, this comes out of the box in React Server Components. And why and how is React Server Components able to do that, we will touch when we look at the demo. Okay, now these are two points that I've added here, which are specific for network. So we'll cover the two kind of in the same slide. So the first one is additional endpoints that power our UI. So what this meant is, initially, again, if I go back, even if I think of just JavaScript-based frontend and backend, it would still be React with Node, yeah, or React with pick your language, Python, Go, Java, whatever. Now, what it usually dealt with was we used to have this kind of coarse edge around the client, and we used to have this coarse edge around the server. And each of them used to be their own separate mental models. The mental models that you would be having for Java maybe might not be applicable to how you would be rendering pages on React, right? So what ended up happening was when I would be creating my service, I would not be thinking about the UI. I would have an endpoint, and then I would just superimpose my client on top of that, right? And in order to superimpose, we would run into challenges, right? So my client needs data in a specific format, let's say it needs JSON fields ABC, but my endpoint is not giving me that, and I would have some kind of data massaging layer in the between, and then slowly what it resulted in is more architectural patterns between client and server. The intent was to make the edges as smooth as possible, right? So that is the first point. That is at least how we have been approaching backend for a while. The second point is network waterfall. So a lot of us would have seen this network waterfall. What that means is, because React is a component-based library, if I have children components that needs data, each of them would actually trigger a fresh request. And if you go into your dev tools, you would actually be seeing a network waterfall. Now, the argument that the React team has made is network waterfalls in themselves are not a bad idea. They are actually kind of good, because if I think of it in a particular way, it helps me control what I need. If I know what I need at a specific level, I can actually tell that, okay, this is the part that I need, and I might not be needing the other bits of the data. The challenge comes when it is client and server. So because it is client and server, and like we talked, there's a chasm in between, that would be the one that would cause bottlenecks for us if we are doing constant back and forth. So with React Server Components, the intent is that we want to avoid the client-server network waterfall. A network waterfall might still exist, but that would be solely on the server. Yeah. Perfect. And finally, top-level awaits. So top-level awaits are kind of a great concept, but I will just go over it very briefly for now. So the idea is that we are able to have awaits in our React component. We are actually able to have async React components. Now, having async React components again does not really fit our mental model very well in terms of how browsers behave. Even if we have some kind of asynchronous code in our React components, we have to deal with it slightly different. But now we have top-level awaits, and basically we have async components in React. Yes. Okay, so now we'll have a quick example. So the example that I will be showing is a 4 from the talk that was given in 2020. I've changed it slightly just to fit the intent of the talk. So what we would want to do is, while I show the example, it is a very basic example. I would want each of you to just think about how you would be building it in React. Yeah, don't think about client or server for now. Think about the concept that you know of React and how you would be able to build it in React. Yeah, cool. So yeah, so this is our component here. This is our app, right? So this is a basic notes app. And the left pane has a search functionality as well as some notes that I had already added. And the right pane gives me the ability to view the notes as well as the ability to edit the notes. So I will just go ahead and edit something. And this is basically respecting markdowns for now. Yeah. So, okay. So with this much, what I would really want to do is take a moment to think around what or how we would approach, at least from a very superficial level, creation of an app like this, right? So I'll just do it. And yeah, so the note is safe. Yeah. Again, I won't be going into the client and server aspects of it yet, but just take a moment to understand a very basic app and how we would be coding it in the React that we know. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I hope everyone has a very basic understanding of how we would be approaching this, and even if not, we have kind of segregated our components into the parts that we started off with, the interactive and the non-interactive. Cool. So this is actually the node component, and this is the server component. What we would do is we would go line by line through the important parts here, and then we re-evaluate the app that we have received. Okay, so the first part. So again, this being a server component, we're actually importing a util called DB. Now, just imagine this as an abstraction over all the operations that you could possibly do from your database, right? The idea itself sounds kind of different, that you are importing a database-specific library in your React code. But yeah, that is one of the initial ideas around server component, that I am again superimposing React and I am superimposing it on the server model. How would I write React on the server? So that's the first one. That I am actually being able to import and use a util that I might be thinking of just specifically in terms of a traditional server. Right? Okay, now the second one. Line 4 is node editor. This is a client component. Yeah, we will again have a look at the exact nature of this. But for now, what we will go with the understanding is that node editor is a client component. A server component can include a client component. Yeah. Okay. Now the next one. So line 9, what I'm doing is actually fetching a node from my DB. Right. Again, in terms of React, it might not be something that you do upfront, but this is kind of what we are doing here. We are actually fetching the node from the DB, and for now our mental model will slightly shift to the point that this is actually running on the server. I'm actually fetching the node from the server where this component is running. Perfect. So now what are we saying? Line 16 is saying that, okay, if the user wants to edit the node, then line 17 is edited, right? Otherwise, nothing is there, right? So if we go back, line 17 is a node editor, correct? What did we cover earlier? That node editor is the client component, right? Now line 16 is the is editing, and is editing is something that we are getting from the props. So again, just a bit of reset and reevaluation. The entire component is running on the server. It gets this prop called is editing, and the moment is editing is true, I will actually be sending 17 as a component over the wire. So I repeat, is editing will be a prop that will be sent to the server. The moment I get that prop, I will actually dynamically be sending node editor as a component over the wire. Yeah. Now all of this is running on the server. So that is the important bit here. Yeah. Cool. So I hope no questions at this point. I hope everyone is able to kind of follow along where we are heading. Yeah. Okay. Now the second part is the bundles that we send to the client. So essentially what we want to come up with is with the idea that if I'm able to get things on the server, then I don't need to send a whole lot of JavaScript utilities to the client. So going back to this example, I have two JavaScript libraries here, line 1, line 2. One is Mark, which supports Markdown, another just sanitizes my HTML. Both of these are major libraries. Even gzip line 2 is a heavy library. But what I want is if I'm able to run this on the server, and if the server gives me something that is raw HTML, CSS, then I don't need to ship this to the client. So that is something again that comes out of the box with React Server Components. Yeah. Okay, so now we look at how the server components will be rendered, right? So we kind of covered that, we are editing a node here, and then we are adding some points here, and we are done with it, right? But what actually goes under the hood when we say that we want to render a React server component? Again, we will build to it in increments, and by the end of it, I hope that we have a clearer picture. Fine. So first up, the browser triggers a request. So now this is kind of a very high abstraction of what happens. The browser triggers a request for a specific action, which is the server. And this is the part about what we have already covered. Now the server component begins to render itself. That is very similar to the node component that we just saw. It is a component that begins to render like a normal React component would. But again, all of this is happening on the server end of it. So one of the bigger ideas around server components, kind of the bottom line around server components is almost all of the server components should be boiled down to HTML and CSS. And that is one of the truths that we'll have to move forward with. That is one of the understandings that will help us build on the later foundations. So again, when I start rendering my server components, and if I am rendering just server components, it would have HTML, CSS only, with a bit of JavaScript, but okay, for now just HTML and CSS. Yeah. But then what about the client component? So we saw that in our Node.js, we had a node editor component, right? We discussed that it is a client component. But if everything is rendered on the server, then what is happening on the client? Cool. So first part is, it is still React. Client components still need to run on the browser. Going back to the first slide, my interactive bits still need a client, right? So how do I handle this fissure in our understanding, this division of understanding, right? So what we do is, when server component starts rendering again from the top and just starts executing each of the commands, the moment it encounters a client component, it replaces it with placeholder. Yeah, so it tells, okay, browser, this part is your responsibility. I don't really know what to do with it. Please take care of it. Good. And then the entire thing, so server components, pure HTML, client components, placeholders, these are packed and then sent to the browser. And that is kind of what we are getting there. Yeah. Cool. So what will we see when we open the network tab in this case? Will we be seeing pure HTML? That is a question. So if someone can answer that. No. We will not be seeing server component. We will not be seeing pure HTML. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that is true. We will not be seeing pure HTML when we open the network tab. So why is that so? So what happens is, we had initially covered that the React Server Components incremental rendering comes out of the box, right? And that the reason for that is there's a specific protocol that they have designed for server components, which is understandable only by React. We will have a look at how the protocol looks like over the wire, but it is not pure HTML, right? This is where the idea kind of converges with SSR. Yeah, so with SSR, one of the outputs that I think we can expect with server-side rendering is we would at least be able to see pure HTML over the network. That is not what happens in this case. We are actually sending a data that React understands, because in the end, React is still the library that is running on my client. Okay, now my browser encounters these placeholders. So yeah, so when my server component was rendering, I had added placeholders for the client component. Now my browser encounters these placeholders, and then it says, okay, now I need to render these components, right? And once the browser is done rendering these components, it's done. That is the entire process. We have our interactive bits, we have our non-interactive bits, we have pure HTML wherever needed, and we have browser in with traditional client-side rendering wherever needed. So let us quickly try something here. Go to the network tab and actually, yeah. So again, this is not a production ready app, first up, right? So if you see what we did here is we said that, okay, as soon as I click on a specific node, we are actually triggering a request to get something from the server. What we want to do is actually do that, right? So once I clicked on edit, we see this component, right? The markdown component. And the node code that we have already seen Now this kind of comes together, right? So my isEdit prop goes, and now I tell that, okay, now this is the client component that I need to send over the wire. So when I say that I am sending components over the wire, that is what I mean. So let's have a look at the response for this. Right, so first up, if I see isEditing goes as true, and it triggers my server component. And yeah, so here, this is not pure HTML, like we had discussed, right? But this is a syntax that is something that only React understands. Now, because of the nature, the inherent nature of this, we'll be able to stream data, right? So if I have some API calls, I would be able to send that when that API call completes, and that this leads to the streaming bit that we had covered. Okay. Yeah. So line 7, if you see node editor is my component that we had discussed, right? Node editor is something that would be sent over the wire as a client component. So this is being sent over the wire as a component. Your components are being sent over the wire. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure. Is it better now? Should I increase it more?
I'm not very sure if you folks are able to follow or see clearly. So if you are facing any difficulty, feel free to come to the front of controls. Thanks.
So yeah, so we see that node editor, as soon as I said that I want to edit, node editor component is actually sent over the wire, and this is the placeholder. So if I search for 7, this is kind of a reference. For a deep dive, please search on module reference objects. That is something React has introduced. We won't be deep diving on that either, but that is tied to the syntax that I'm trying to show. But this 7 actually comes here. So this is a reference to the 7 here, and that is how React Server Component understands that I need to render node editor as a client component on the client. Yeah. Okay. So there are parts that I have intentionally abstracted out here. There are parts that are open to the implementation, and there are parts that React team itself has not talked about. React Server Components is a spec. They have added a lot of implementation, but they have left a bunch of implementation out for the frameworks and bundles and things like that. So we have not covered that. But in the entire flow, there will be parts that will be played by the server, caching as well as the bundle. So again, we'll have to be a bit more aware when we talk about servers now. As a UI dev, I think we are kind of inherently becoming full stack once we start approaching the server components a bit. Cool. So puzzles. Now, these are some open questions. Some of them have answers, right? So like I had said, they would be the anti-aims that we would not be covering as a part of our slides. So this is the part where we will be kind of going over them. Some of them are still open, so they're not answered. Yeah. Okay, so the first question. Should we migrate all our apps to RS? Now, this is a strong stance. What the React team says is that because of the inherent nature and the syntax and the huge amount of work it took them to make it backward compatible, kind of. You don't need to migrate all of them right away. But what we need to do is be aware that this is kind of where we are heading in the future. If we are able to have a pure server components app, it would be great. So when I say server components app, it would be a mix of server components, client components, and shared components. But we don't need to migrate them right away. We can have our incremental adoption and migrate bits and pieces of it. Each of the migration will come with its own set of challenges. Because again, like I said, the umbrella is not on browser anymore. It is on browser, server, and anything in between, right? So if you have your layers of caching, if you have your layers of gateway, if you have any CDNs maybe. So a lot of open points there. But yeah, don't migrate all of it in one go. Plan it well. How do we handle routing? Now this is one of the parts where the frameworks come in. So the routers play a very important role now, right? So this is kind of where we take some of the topics from NTM. So next router, right? The Next.js router, the latest version of it comes with inbuilt support for server components. The reason for that is, if we go back here, if you see, this is like I said, not prod ready. We are actually sending that, I am editing certain things and I don't want to edit certain things. In an ideal scenario, these won't really be network calls. These would be some things that would be handled by your router by your router telling your server components that, okay, this is the time when I need you to be active. This is the time when I need my client components and things like that. So the router now plays a much more important role, and it is again evolving. So Next has a separate take on it against Remix, but at this point, Next.js router is the most evolved for server component handling. How much of the implementation depends on frameworks now? So this is one of the debatable parts about the way server components was proposed and how it is heading. So in the latest release of Next that they did, they introduced the app directory. They said that everything in app directory is supposed to be a server component by default, and then you can use React server components there. But the idea is that if I am trying to create a bare bones app, and I am trying to add packages on my own, I won't be able, or I will be able to do it, but it is slightly challenging, right? So more and more of React will now be relying on frameworks, and even if you go to the latest documentation of React, that is what they say, that in some of the cases just rely on the frameworks. So we are kind of relying into Next, Remix, and all of these specific implementations for server component. But the idea was again clear from kind of day one, because like I said, React Server Components is a spec. There are parts that React team has done for us and parts that they have told, okay, this is how much we are going to do. Now it's up to the community and the framework authors to be able to include it. Right? So yeah, so at this point, we have Next that has server components. We have Remix. We had Hydrogen, which is a Shopify's framework, but Hydrogen kind of moved away from server component very recently because they found it slightly complex to maintain. But yeah, those are the top three that come to the top of my mind. Right. Now this is, yeah.
How about Astro?
Good. Astro. So Astro, while we started off, I think one of the slides we had covered earlier, when we were fragmenting out our components was interactive and non-interactive. Astro is a very different framework in that it brings your own frameworks. But one of the underlying ideas behind Astro is islands. You have interactive bits, non-interactive bits, you separate them out into islands, and Astro will actually just send the JavaScript that is needed to the client. It might not be React server component, but conceptually it is very close to what we would get with close to zero JavaScript sent to the cloud. Does that answer your question?
Is it following React server
components? No, not fully. It has concepts similar to React server components, but not React. You can plug in React as a library with Astro, but it has some errors. It is not readily integrated. Yeah.
It can take any framework.
Yeah. You can have adapters for specific frameworks. So if you are working with Astro and you're like, okay, what am I supposed to do? I know React, you'll be actually able to use React with Astro. I think I'm selling Astro, but yeah, it is an awesome framework. Go and check it out. Yeah. So will colocating code add more complexity and security issues? Now, this is kind of a dev specific aspect now. Like I said, we are inherently becoming full stack, right? We are placing our client-side code and server-side code in the same file. So the idea of co-location itself is very fraught with danger, right? We are having some kind of code that is actually accessing the server. We are having some client components that are readily reading and then rendering bits and pieces from it. This is still open to discussion around how you are approaching your migration, how much of your backend-ish code you are bringing to your common files, and how much of your frontend are you still relying on with the migration that you're taking place. But yeah, this is something that we still have to explore. Maybe we will unearth more issues, we'll find more problems and solve them as we undertake more migrations. What role will bundlers play, right? So bundlers, right now, Turbo is the only one kind of that is actively contributing towards or building towards server components. Both Webpack and Beat have the plugins needed, but you won't be able to integrate it out of the box. You can go and search on GitHub. Beat has a running sample of React server components. Webpack does that well, but it is kind of not a very good DX at this point. Finally, what about SSR? I think we touched on this for a while. The end result from SSR that I expect ideally is kind of HTML, CSS, at least very less JavaScript as much as possible. What we would define it as SSR and server components are two orthogonal ideas. both of them can coexist. Server components are components over the wire. SSR is you are rendering something on the server. You can still have server components and then render them on the server. You can still have some kind of client components, render them on the server and send it to the browser. Again, I'm abstracting a lot of details, but the core idea is that we should not be mixing the two as the same concept. And now, open to audience. So yeah, folks, any questions across all the centers, or if we have any questions here? Oh my God. Okay, good. Yeah, you can start.
How do we approach testing? Because one file contains
the question, sorry.
Okay, so maybe I will just repeat the question from Pune. So the question is, how do we approach testing for React Server components? That is a very good question. Now the idea is, again, in an ideal scenario, we would be able to test client and server in isolation. Not so anymore. None of the testing frameworks have been able to reach to a point, at least in terms of releases, to be able to do this for us. I don't have a proper answer to this question yet, but what I can say is one of the ideas that might work is testing the client components in isolation, that like we used to earlier. We would still have the ability to mock them out, but in terms of the server components itself, we might have to come up with a fresh idea to just test the server part. We might be needing some kind of contract testing kind of a framework to be able to test the integration between our server and client components that are interleaved, but it is still open to discussion. Anyone else wants to share some insight on the testing part? Okay, so we can go to the next question.
So what I understood is this React Server components is an architectural style. If we remove React from server components, RSA, we just focus on server components.
Right.
Can we think of them in terms of Jamstack?
So one of the ideas behind Jamstack, and that is where I said that SSR is orthogonal to RSC. So similarly, I would put Jamstack would also be orthogonal to RSC. So React Server Components is React superimposed on the server. You are using React on the server. Now, the idea is that I am able to fetch things from the database. I am able to do backendish stuff with React. Conceptually, it is similar, as in if I remove the React part out of it, I do things on the server and then I let client handle the things that it does. So conceptually, it is similar, but like I said, there are two important differences here. One is the way React is dealing with it is slightly different because you would have your React models here. You won't be able to use your client use effect. None of the client hooks would work on a server component. Second part is because it is a specification, and like we saw in the network tab, there is a very specific syntax that React itself is supporting. That okay, I am React Server component. I won't be relying on the traditional network or a JSON response that will be sending me. I would have my own array of JSONs, and that is what I would be supporting. Conceptually, it will get close, but I think where we are heading is actually combining client and server and not thinking of them as two different entities. Think of them as one entity that my server is actually located next to me and I'm interacting with on the fly. And now if I have to write one code that runs on the server but caters to my browser, then how can I approach that? Right? So conceptually similar, but I would still say there's a massive delta between how React is approaching it versus how other frameworks do. Even the traditional frameworks like PHP would do it.
Did we use anywhere
So
in production?
In prod, not that I know of. So one of the issues is that people are slightly skeptical following or building on the app directory of Next.js at this point. So the app directory of Next.js was something that was released earlier this year. Anyways, so the idea is that a lot of React Server components bits are by default there. So the moment you start integrating that, you will be seeing that React Server components are there. Hydrogen have been using React Server components for the past 2 years. So a lot of Shopify's use cases are actually using React Server components.
I think one of the other ideas is that Anya also mentioned, correct, we are moving toward isometric. So if you see a lot of frameworks, they actually start building examples where your front-end code is also talking to your database directly. With Prisma and all coming into picture, correct? So this is where it's all moving on, right? You need to know everything now.
Yeah, there's a question.
So I have two questions.
Yeah.
Like RSC is kind of new, so I think taking my stupid questions. So my first question is obviously RSC has many advantages it might have. But what I want to know specifically is about in terms of performance. I mean, do we have any advantages in terms of performance over the traditional?
Right. So that is kind of where RSC came into place. The idea of RSC came in the first place. Like I said, we started off with the challenge that all of the other stacks, all of the other components of my network are getting faster, right? We might be having edge rendering, we might be having 5G pretty soon. Now, how do I cater to an application that is as performant as possible while being in the React spectrum? So when I say that I am actually sending less JavaScript over the wire, I am actually able to send as less packets of data over the network. What I'm telling the browser is, okay, you don't have to do a massive chunk of the work. You kind of are able to handle HTML on your own. I'm giving you that. You might need some client components, but I will reduce the client components to as less as possible. So hence I said that for folks who might have worked on React, and I understand there who might not have. So the initial notes that I showed, if you would approach it again from a React perspective and think of the React that you know, even if it is server or client, does not really matter. How would you be doing this? All of this bundle would be shipped out to maybe the client. Maybe you would do some code splitting, but it would still be a part of the bundle, right? And then you would be dynamically, a lot of this code would be running on the browser. With server components, you might not even need that anymore. So the left pane where I'm seeing the notes headlines and the right pane where I'm seeing the sections are actually my server components that have actually just told me, okay, this is the HTML. The browser does not need to run a JavaScript for this. Right? So yeah, it is kind of one of the primary motivations for coming to React Server Components.